I'm Derek Fortini, Estes Park Museum Director. It's September 27th, 2021. Today I'll be interviewing Dorothy Scott Gibbs at the Owl's Nest, which is located at 1240 Devil's Gulch Road. Please state your name, your birth date, and where you were born.
I am Dorothy Langelier Scott Gibbs, otherwise known as Dorothy Gibbs, or whatever. Curiously, I was always Dorothy, except for a very short time in college when I was living at home for various reasons, and my father got to the point where if he said Dorothy, both my mother, Dorothy Carnine Scott, and I would answer. Whereas growing up, if he said Dorothy, I knew he was talking to me, and if he said Dorothy, she knew he was talking to her. But for that short time, about 3 years, when I developed another name, it was my mother who became Dot, and I remained Dorothy. So I've always been Dorothy. And if people say Dorothy from Kansas, I say, well, 3 of my 4 grandparents were from Kansas, and the 4th one came to Kansas at age 3 in a covered wagon and settled there. And the Langeliers, she was a Langelier, there are still some Langelier connections in Kansas. But I wasn't born there. I did go to 8th grade. It was actually 9B, half of 8, in Wichita in 1939, living with cousins there because the Virginia schools in 1939 they only had 11 grades at that time. My parents had home educated me off and on until my mother couldn't stand doing it anymore, and they sent me back to public school, and then they couldn't stand the public school, so I grew up with at least 4 different years of the Calvert course. Calvert is still advertised here and there. It is a wonderful homeschooling. It's useful particularly for diplomats around the world that still use Calvert School. And I have a Calvert speller down there in the bottom somewhere. But that was the only time we visited Kansas. I grew up living in Virginia in the Jim Crow era, because that's where my father got a job teaching chemistry after he got his PhD in Chicago, which is where he had met my mother. And I think everybody's heard this story, that my father wrote back to his father in Kansas. He met this beautiful young lady, Dorothy Carnine, who said that her family was from Kansas. She happened to have been born in Hannaford, North Dakota, where her father was a Presbyterian minister at the time. But I'm getting off track there. Okay, when she met my father in Chicago, they're both in graduate school, and he wrote back to his father. Grandpa Scott wrote back to Daddy and said, I know more about the Carnines than know about themselves. Turned out that he did. Seriously, he did. My 2 grandfathers were born on adjoining farms right outside Iola, Kansas. And my grandfather's great-granddaughter, Susan Lynn, she's retaken her maiden name, is the current editor of the Iola Daily Register, which Grandpa started way back when. And her daughter, Grandpa Scott's great-great-granddaughter, is the current person working. She's helping her mother run the paper. And so I still claim my Kansas roots, even though I can't do much with it. But I I've come to like Kansas a lot more since the days when we were living in Virginia. We'd come out to the Scottage, and this is where my connection with Estes Park begins, because Grandpa Scott had the Scottage built by Charlie Chapman, Abner Sprague's nephew, if I've got it right, in 1899. Well, Daddy was born in 1894, so he didn't get to go to the Scottage until he was about 4 or so. But from then on, he did. And my first, Estes Park was simply where the Scottage was. And of course, it didn't become the national park until 1915. So when I was volunteering up at Bear Lake, and I would get to sounding very know-it-all with some of the visitors, they would say, "So were you born in Colorado?" "No," I have to say, "but I was conceived here in the park up at Thunder Lake," because when I had been up there as a volunteer in uniform with a radio, and privileged because of the way things were in those days to bring my family up to stay overnight in in the ranger cabin up at Thunder Lake, my niece told me that her grandmother, my mother, had told her that that was where I was conceived. So that was the summer of 1949, 1920. Okay, I was born in 1927. They would have been 26. They were married in 26, spent that summer at the Scottage. I've got another story there, but I'll keep it for later. So I was conceived up in Estes Park. I mean, what is now the national park, but wasn't then. And we used to drive out first in my father's old Franklin from Virginia, stop in Iola, stop in Colorado Springs, where my grandmother Carnine was at the time, and come on out here and spend the summer, because Daddy had the full 3-month academic summer vacation. My mother had painted all her life. We think of her now as a stone lithographer, which she was, but basically she was a painter, an artist. And she painted that painting of Shove Chapel in Colorado Springs. The year I did get to go there for my freshman year, and she and I drove out from Virginia. It was about our last year in Virginia, because Daddy transferred to Syracuse. Actually, from Sweetbriar. He asked for a leave of absence from Sweetbriar. Do you know Sweetbriar College in Virginia? You have heard of it? A lot of people haven't. It is a private liberal arts women's college in the middle of Virginia with the most beautiful grounds. I could go on and on about that. But that's where my sister and I grew up. It was a college campus, and it had college professors whose homes we visited, and they visited us. So it wasn't exactly like the rest of Jim Crow, Virginia, although I did go to an all-white school. And later in high school, I took the bus into Lynchburg. Sweetbriar's near Lynchburg, Virginia. And there at the bus station, I drank from I don't remember now whether the drinking fountain was labeled, but the one around the corner was labeled colored. You know that in those days, black was not the polite word. Colored was the one. Well, colored now it's off the, Anyway.
What town were you living in when you were born in Virginia?
We didn't live in a town. We lived on the, well, just first right on the campus of Sweetbriar College, which is out in the country, 13 miles from Lynchburg. So I did go to high school in Lynchburg. And I was aware of Estes Park. I knew it was a town. You've probably, whether you've heard, at least you've had access to the stories about how my grandmother, they would get they would come down to town to get their groceries. Of course, they had a lot of things shipped out from Kansas by train, and then, no, I can't go on that about how my father first came into Estes Park when he was a child by stagecoach and the toll road up there. But where are we? I was about to tell about my grandmother and the grocer, if I can remember who he was, very famous.
The Sam Service?
Yes, thank you. Because his sign said SAM''L. And I heard this from the family, not personally because I wasn't old enough then, but she called him Samuel. And they all thought that was very funny. Anyway, that's about all I knew about the town. I knew the stories my father would tell of picking up the mail from the mailbox that was right across what is now the Bear Lake Road. It was there's a big rock. If you're going along the Bear Lake Road, just below Eagle Cliff, where the Scottage up on the hill just to your left, just before you go down to where the road crosses the Thompson, there is a big rock with a kind of a split in it. And it was right near there that the mailbox, the post office was. And those were the days, in fact, even in my early days, you could address letters to so-and-so, UEC Scott, the Scottage, Estes Park. And it got there. But my first memories of the Scottage itself, in midsummer, my sister and I would get up in the morning and go down in front of the fireplace to put on our clothes because there was no central heating. There still isn't. It's still there. And my cousins 3 times removed, get to take their children there. So I remember that. I remember Betty Ruth, my sister, Betty Ruth Scott Taylor. I still have a nephew, Timothy Taylor, in Texas, and her second husband was Dick Culbertson. So I have some wonderful step-nieces named Culbertson, all of them back east. Where were we? Early memory, which one? My sister and I, yes. We slept in the front room, which is on the second floor and has a balcony out in front. Incidentally, that balcony has what I know is the best view in the world. I have been around the world at other people's expense because we got to do all kinds of interesting things that ended up with us completing the whole circuit. And I have seen some wonderful views, and there isn't any better view in the world than the view of Moraine Park and Longs Peak and Chapin, Chiquita, and Ypsilon, and all the ones in between it from the balcony of the Scottage. But this particular memory is when Betty Ruth and I went out. I don't think we slept out there, but somehow we went out at the right time of evening and were watching the star over what is the mountain that's the last one down from Trail Ridge? It's on the right there. Anyway, there was a star in the sky. We saw it set. It just disappeared, just blinked out like that. I can't tell why it was so memorable, but it absolutely was. My mother was painting all the time. And a lot of places that we got to see, including the year that we spent in Brazil when I was 14, were when Daddy would take her out painting, and we kids would get to go along and explore and have fun and see things ourselves. Lots and lots of other memories of this cottage, including my husband died in 2011, but he and I got to come out here and stay at this cottage, if I remember correctly, more than once. So, oh, there was one other thing that I remember about Estes Park. Going to Sunday school at what's now the old church shops, because it was the church then. I guess it was Presbyterian even then, but it was the community church. And that happens to be, well, you don't want the whole long story about how I ended up being Methodist, but our Methodist church here at Estes Park is wonderful. The United Methodist Women here they're my support group. They really are. And I haven't been back to the community church. I've been there to the wonderful new position it's in, the new place that it's in. But I've only been there for funerals and weddings and recycling. But I have good friends there, and I admire it very much. But the Methodist church here, my mother happened to turn Methodist when there was kind of a split in the community church. They were disagreed as to spending all this money on building this new, fancy new building outside, and Mama thought it should all go to foreign missions. Well, the Methodists were just getting to the point where they were realizing there were enough Methodists around here, maybe they could have a Methodist church. So she started going with them. She died in Estes Park in 93, at age 90. And of course we had her funeral here. The lady who was the pastor at the time was just wonderful. I could look her name up. It's on the wall at the Methodist Church. And she was able to plan it with us very, very nicely. So when, let's see, that was 93 that she died. By that time, George and I were living in Kettering, Ohio. I won't get up and let Katie in. If she asks, you can let her in. And she's happy out there for a long time. Yeah. She's a rescue dog, Katie is. Has done us all a lot of good the last few years. So, Estes Park. Well, way back when we drove out Moraine and to get to the Scottage, when you first got up, let's see, beyond where the big slide is now, just a little bit beyond that, it was meadow, bare meadow. In fact, I don't know how much of it has developed since you were here, but I have good friends who have been there. I think it's a wonderful place, those housing development out there. But I hated to see, as all of us do who remember things in the old days.
Going back to being in Moraine Park, there's some lodges right around that area. Did you ever spend any time at any of the lodges there?
That's a good question, because Stead's was there in those days. And I was completely unaware of it. We couldn't afford to eat out. We didn't eat out in Estes Park. We didn't eat out anywhere. We ate at home or ate our sack lunches when we were hiking. But I do remember when Betty Ruth and I were sleeping in the upstairs room there, about dark or dusk, seeing cars, seeing the headlights trailing out from there's still a trail there. It cuts corner across, but in those days it was a road, and I learned that the cars were all coming back about 8 p.m. or so from a ranger talk that had been given at Stead's, which we didn't go to. So we didn't go to any of the lodges. I remember my father's talking about Grandma, Abner Sprague's. Well, this is all, Jim Pickering has done the most marvelous job of recording all this. You can look it up easily. I've got some of the books there. But I was really unaware. Oh, no, I have one other memory of the Fern Lake Lodge. It's a more recent one because it wasn't still in business, but it was before it was torn down. Just, it was while I was volunteering up there. And again, I was in uniform with a radio. And this, again, I was able to have my family who had little mountain horses, and they could take us backpacking here and there. I could get permission to stay in a ranger cabin that was not being used by the rangers if I arranged it ahead of time. Can't do that these days, but and we stayed in the ranger cabin at Fern Lake, and we could see the old Fern Lake Lodge over there. It was, I wouldn't say it was in ruins, but it was certainly out of business. I remember seeing what kind of little animal was it? It wasn't a chipmunk or a ground squirrel. Oh dear, there goes my memory. Up on the porch. But what I really remember from that trip is when there was a rescue going on. As a volunteer, I had my radio, and we ended up, myself and my niece and her husband and their daughter, I'm hoping I get this right because she's still around and very, very, very active, wonderful person, Rachel Coyce. They were involved in this rescue. They ended up, I think it was Bob Coyce, who was given a ranger's radio and asked to go up to, what is that lake that's up above Fern Lake on the right there? It isn't Crystal. Oh dear, my memory is gone. And so I've got if we needed to, we don't, I've got a park map right out there. I could look it up. But at any rate, that was a successful rescue. It was my niece who saw the lady who was missing, recognized her because of the description of the scarf she was wearing, and it all came out well. So volunteering in the park was one of the best, most fun things I ever did in my life.
So I have a question about that. You volunteered from, you were saying 1995 to 2017, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a long time. Would you say you wanted to do that because of your family's connection to the Scottage and Moraine Park, or is there something even more than that that you enjoyed about the park?
That is a good question that I can't really answer. We loved the park. I grew up spending summers in the Scottage, and the family all saying, oh, the park will take over the Scottage one of these days. And that was, Project 66 or something like that, where they were trying to take over all the private property and get rid of it. Well, things changed over the years. The Scottish was never a willing seller, and so the park didn't get it then, and it got to the point eventually where Farrell Atkins, when he was doing the historical tours around, he would stop at the Scottish and tell stories about it, and then he would go on to the William Allen White cabin, which is younger, by the way, than the Scottish. The Scottish was built before it was, and when Mr. White bought it, he bought it from the original people who had owned it. But he and my grandfather Scott had been friends way, way back. Where am I now? Trying to answer 3 different questions.
Well, that's fine. With William Allen White, do you have any stories, either you personally, about interactions with him, or stories that your families might have told you about him?
Well, he was based in Emporia, and my father was in Iola, but they were both newspapermen, and that brought them close. They ended up being slightly different politically, but still friends. My father was a Kansas congressman, a Republican, as all the good people were in those days. And I do want you to see me rolling my eyes. So I knew of Mr. White, and I do have one memory of being taken down there and seeing him sitting in his armchair with his pipe. What I remember a little better is his son, young Bill, they called him, and young Bill's daughter, who was an adopted daughter, must have been during World War II, when people were rescuing the English kids. And if I can get this story right, I didn't ever meet her myself, Mary White. I have pictures in one of these boxes right here. There's a picture of Mary White and her best friend and all the other children all lined up on a street in Emporia. And that ended up with my family somehow. My father was very, would he have known Mary? I don't know. But at any rate, the White family were friends. And later, they sold out to the park. And, so the daughter, not Mary's daughter, but her brother's daughter, what was her name? It was a different name that was made up for the movie that was about her. Oh, I should look all this up. But I thought that was very exciting, that they lived right down there. So, volunteering. I'm not sure, because I would come out, my husband worked all summer, and he worked year-round, and he worked for Mead Paper. And he had a regular vacation, and we would sometimes come out here. As a matter of fact, we volunteered with the Mountain Club or something, but we were recruited to build or work on trails all over. Not here until later, but there was a trail up on the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, and we got to spend 2 weeks up there working hard. There was one up in the Oregon coast and some others. So that's how we got into volunteering at all. I think it was George who saw them advertising for people to do it. And then I guess we must have learned eventually that there were volunteers here in Estes Park. So I had my both knees replaced same day here in Fort Collins, no, in Loveland, out east of Loveland. My what do you call the bone specialist? Anyway, the one I had back in Dayton came to a seminar of some kind out here in the summer. And he came back and he said, I was ready to have both my knees replaced, but wait until he knew we were getting ready to move to Colorado. Wait until you get out there. And Dr. Johnson at the ophthalmology, not what is the word for bone?
I can't think of it off the top.
Anyway,
Yeah.
that he had heard that Dr. Johnson, I think it was Robert Johnson, talk about doing both in the same operation, same day, and that I should wait. And I did, and I had them both done same day down there. Of course, it put me out for a while, but I had George to bring me meals. We were living in the old house at that time. And George, right away then, started volunteering for the park. So when I was able to use my knees, I signed up too. And this little thing, it says Elk Bugle Corps, and it says for 5 years service. Well, I served the Elk Bugle Corps for 20 years. And it was so much fun. Right now, they're doing that up in the park with the Bugle Corps people are up there working away and having a great time. Unfortunately, these days, mostly what you have to do is tell the cars where not to park. You don't get to watch the elk quite as much as we used to do, but it's still very useful.
So I have it in here that you were retired from Ohio and returned to Estes Park in 1994.
Yes.
Right around there. What is it that brought you back?
It was teaching in Japan, where my husband got me a job teaching English at Aoyama Gakuin Daingaku University, that made me realize I did like teaching, even if only as a high school teacher. So when we came back from Japan, he encouraged me to take a graduate course at the University of Virginia that would help me get my teacher's certification, which I eventually did, and taught near Dayton, where we were living at the time. But I must detour briefly. It has nothing to do with Estes Park, but you can delete this if you wish. It was when I was taking a graduate course at the University of Virginia in speech. What is speech? How do you speak? What are languages? Because I was going to be teaching, I had taught English as a foreign language, and I was going to be teaching French or German or Latin or something. How do you do it? And part of our graduate course was going over to the University of Virginia Hospital and seeing a cadaver and seeing the speech mechanism. First time I'd ever done anything like that, but it was done so professionally, so smoothly, that it didn't bother me. It was just fascinating, was all. But I remember that after the person in charge of the lab finished his part of it, he said to us students, grad students who were standing around, he said he sort of apologized for the state of the cadaver. It's so hard to get them these days. We have to get them from the poorhouse. And from there, I learned about what we now have in place and what we did with George's remains, whole body donation. And that is something I'm so in favor of, so enthusiastic about, that if anybody wants to know more about it, I tell them about it right away. But I got certified and got a job teaching French near Dayton. When we moved out here, Okay, let's see. Okay, I taught in Kettering, Ohio then for quite a long time, and that's where I retired from in 1990. So we lived in Kettering, outside of Dayton, until 94. I came out here for my mother's funeral and went back to Dayton. But by that time, we had arranged things with my sister. My sister and I were the heirs of my parents. My father had died previously, very early. He, of course, was the one who introduced us to Estes Park. And he was responsible for acquiring the basic part of the Owl's Nest and the land where it is now, where we are now. I have met people out here who know where Kettering is. One of the fun things about volunteering in the park is meeting people from all over. I had been able, I must re-digress a little bit. The Korean War, and we stayed on in Japan for a year and a half after that, came back to this country. George would have liked to finish his college degree, but the Army wasn't giving you leave for that at that time. So he resigned his commission. He was a captain in the Army by that time, and went back to school and was going to end up being a CPA. He did it for a little while. We bought a house in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is a wonderful place, in spite of the bad things we've read about it sometimes. It's still, the University of Virginia is wonderful. It has changed amazingly, for the good, mostly. We had bought a house, worked some on installing some of the insulation ourselves, and were settling down when, because of connections we had both with Syracuse and with Japan, we had become acquainted with the International Christian University, which was being started at the time. My mother headed up the Syracuse drive to raise enough money for a faculty house at ICU. ICU is currently a well-celebrated university in Japan. George got an invitation to come out and serve as assistant to the vice president for finance at ICU. We had both been in Japan. We had both loved it. We didn't discuss it. We just said yes. And that's where we went then the following year. Where are we now? We were back from Japan in 52 and 53, and it was 56 that we went to Japan and ended up spending 3 years there and had a wonderful time. And I have some wonderful photographs of our time there. Lots of things we could say. And so we didn't come back to the States for 3 years. It was at the end of those 3 years that my father, who had to retire from Syracuse, which he disapproved of, but he got a job teaching in Taiwan. They went there for 2 years, so I went 5 years without seeing my parents at all, and certainly not coming here to Estes Park. Was the first time I got back after having been for some years? But I had kept in touch with all of the Scottish family, and I still am. There's no one there right now because it's after season, but there were people, this is the end of September, there were people there to the middle of September. And where am I going now? Where do you want me to go?
What was it like to come back after being gone for so long?
Oh, yeah.
Estes Park.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me think. When was the first, in our time, yours and mine, remarkable flood? Was that 2013?
A lot of people talk about the 2013 flood, the 1982 flood for downtown, 1976.
What was going on? Did you say 76?
76.
Okay.
Yeah, the Big Thompson flood.
In 1976, my father had passed away, and my mother was living here in what we call the old house by herself, painting and entertaining people for tea or people for organizations of different kinds. In 1976, I happened to be leading a student tour to France. And we were in Paris. We were getting ready to come home. We had been in Paris for the laying of the wreath at the Arc de Triomphe and all this in celebration of the United States centennial, bicentennial, what was it? Tricentennial by that time. And we were boarding the plane to come home, my students and I. And one of them saw an English language newspaper, and the flood in Estes Park was in that newspaper in Paris. Well, some of my students had been on a tour that was sponsored by our high school that came out here, and as part of it, I had arranged for them to visit my mother's studio here. And it was some of those students that were on this tour in Paris, and they were telling me about this flood, and they said, "Oh, Dorothy, how aren't you worried about your mother?" And well, I was surprised to hear about the flood, but I said, "Her home is up on a little ridge. It will be okay," which of course it was and has been since then. So I learned later that my niece and nephew had come and visited my mother, and they had gone downtown after the flood and helped McDonald.
Bookstore. The bookstore?
Yes, what's her name?
Paula.
Paula, yes. Helped Paula dig some of those books out of the mud in front of the bookstore.
Well, since you brought up the cabin, let's talk about the owl's nest a little bit. And I'm very curious to start with, where did the name come from?
That is easy. It's a good question. It's easy. They established the middle part of the old house. That was what they bought and moved from down about where the park headquarters are now, put there, but with the idea that and they did immediately start building the east wing, the main part of which was to be a studio for my mother with a big window that would look right out at, there's my mind, what's the
Twin Owls?
Well, what's the ridge? Lumpy Ridge. Look right out at Lumpy Ridge and at the owls. So, since it was right there, well, this was the owl's nest. And I am very insistent to this day that it be spelled O-W-L-S, plural, apostrophe, possessive, because there are two owls right out there. So it's always been the owl's nest, and these days when whoever is doing the street signs doesn't allow you to use apostrophes. I hate the fact that they are saying that we live on Devil's Devils Gulch. We don't need more than one devil. It's devil apostrophe S Gulch Road. But that's where it got its name.
When you say the original park headquarters, are you talking about High Drive?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. It used to be that the High Drive, the old High Drive, went right by what is now would be below the headquarters. And that's why it looks like such a nice entry down there. They originally thought that would be the main entrance. And now, of course, the High Drive itself is about a block up this way from it.
And do you know what year it was moved over here? Or roughly even speaking?
Not off the top of my head. I probably could think of it, but I don't think of it at the moment. Let me see. It would have been early on. I can remember when the entrance, when we would come out in the summer, and to get to the Scottage, we went up what actually is now Spur 66, and what was then the Dutch Inn, that later turned into the Dunraven Inn. And Dunraven, of course, has moved its name elsewhere, but the building is still there. And to get into the park, then, just before the cabin, you turned right and followed the road up there. There's still a path. Have you ever walked up that way?
Yeah, it was a while back.
Yeah, yeah.
I
And
think that was the Big Thompson entrance.
yes, yes. So that's where the main entrance was in those days. The main entrance into the park was you turned right just before what was recently the Dunraven Inn, and then you turned left to go up to Bear Lake, crossed the bridge, pretty much close to the same as it is now, but probably some different. Or you turned right to go past the William Allen White House and the Scottage and the what's now the Discovery Center. But to us it was always the museum. It was always the what was that lodge called, Mrs.
The Moraine Park Lodge?
Moraine Park Lodge, thank you, yes. I remember going in when I was quite small, when it was still a private lodge, to the building that I think is the only one that's still there. Because the floor arrangement is not too different from what it was, but I must have been quite small. But I was allowed to go in by myself and walk past the receptionist desk where the guests would sign in, and on the wall there at the side there was the doorway. Here was the counter, and the doorway was there. And on the wall right there was a plaque with hooks on it. And you could ask at the desk, and they would give you rubber jar rings that you could throw over those hooks there. So that's my memory of the lodge before it was acquired by the park.
Coming back to the Owl's Nest, this might be a tough one or an easy one. Do you have a favorite feature of this house?
Whole bunch of them. The fireplace in the old living room has an elk antler, a pair of elk antlers on top of it. And it used to be, until Peter moved them elsewhere in the living room, there were 7 black wood carved statues. Those were the 7 immortals, the Chinese house gods that my father had brought back from China in 1925. And they were always on the mantle. Growing up at Sweetbriar, when we moved to Syracuse, and then I inherited them after my mother's death because they lived here, and they are still there in the living room. But the antlers there date back to 1934. I'd have to figure out, I may be a year or two wrong, when my parents were on their way home from spending the summer in Estes Park, and they went through Colorado Springs to see my grandmother Carnine, and ended up, I don't know how long they discussed this, whether at all, but they must have, ended up leaving my mother and her two daughters, my little brother was born months later, there in a rented house in Colorado Springs for me to go to first grade at Garfield School in Colorado Springs, because the Virginia schools were so awful. They didn't even have kindergarten in those days in Virginia, and my mother had used the Calvert School kindergarten to teach us at home. So they left, Daddy left us because he was going on home to Sweetbriar to build a house, which turned out to be the one that it's in the oil painting just around the corner there, which we call the Sweetbriar Cottage, which is still there, still owned by a professor at Sweetbriar. Well, while that that school year, when my mother was in Colorado Springs, my father was back in Virginia, my grandfather Carnine was a Presbyterian minister he and my grandmother didn't get along in later years, so she did her antique shops here and there and everywhere, and he went off with this and that. And Mama visited him up there on a hunting trip that he and some friends took. I've got to make this, because I could go on and on about that. But the very last, Mama dressed appropriately for hiking and hunting until the very last day when they were getting ready to head back to town. And she dressed in a dress. And the men had gone off, and they came back with their first and only elk I think they'd been gone several days, a week or something. And those are the antlers that are now on our mantle there in the old house living room. At the end of the school year, Mama, was it our old Franklin? Did Daddy leave that with her out here? I'll have to do some research on that. But there was a car that she drove my sister and me back to Virginia in with two pairs of antlers. I know because we have a photograph of it, and I don't know where the other pair came from or where it went. But that was the pair that she has a photograph of herself in a skirt holding on to the antlers after the elk had been shot when they went back up to get it, and she was given it and went back. That's not very well organized story, but...
So with your connection now to these two historic structures, the Scottage, the Owl's Nest, what are your hopes for those structures?
Oh, yes. Just that, in this case, the Owl's Nest, it remain in the family and be able to be a place that family comes back to and visits or stays in or inherits through the years, because it's pretty solid. It should last, as the Scottage has. And for the Scottage, I would love to see it stay in the hands of my cousin in the same way. And so far as I know, their plans are the same. So just let it go on. I've serving the world, which, as big and full of fun stuff as this is, as I've told you, rather embarrassing. It embarrasses me to live in such a sumptuous place compared to many people in the world. We try to share what we can. We don't do enough.
So, kind of an open question. Why have you chosen Estes Park as your permanent home for the last 30 years?
Because I've been blessed to inherit enough so that with enough money to buy out my sister's part, we could afford it. We could never afford to come in now and buy something like this. To be perfectly honest, we just couldn't. We have enough to sustain it, I hope, into the future. But we were just lucky and blessed. And the fact that while my sister and I both ended up married to native Virginians, my husband, George Gibbs, the Gibbs family goes way back, no, not important in Virginia history, but they do go way back to the early 1600s. And my sister's husband had a long Virginia history. My husband loved coming out here, loved the mountains. He didn't like being so far from the sea, but he loved the mountains. My sister's husband, who died this past year, about a year after she did, the mountains had too many rocks. That is honestly what he said. And so my sister, bless her heart, was fine with everything, and she loved Virginia. And I loved and love Colorado. I never dreamed that I'd be blessed enough to actually live here. So it's just, I just love it.
I want to ask just a couple of questions about your mother. If you had to describe her to somebody who had never met her, what was she like, and what were some of her, characteristics like?
A nice, ordinary lady who could be very interesting if you got to know her. She was social. She taught anybody who was around her, her family, to see the beauty in things. She didn't push it on you, but she was reasonably attractive, well-bred. What else can I say? Not much. There was a great deal to her. The fact that I enjoyed showing Lars Sage her sketchbooks. We have a pile of them that I had never looked through. But I look through them and I see these pencil sketches or chalk sketches, or sometimes actually with some paint on them, that I see, oh, that's her first sketch for that painting or that painting. Because she was a painter. She was not just a printer. She was not just a stone lithographer, while she was proud of that. It was the oil painting that I think of as being the center of her life. But after my father retired while they were still in Syracuse, she joined the Syracuse printmakers. Later, when they were in Long Beach and he was teaching at Southern Cal, she took courses out there. In fact, there was one course where she ended up helping the professor teach some of the techniques in stone lithography, or I don't know the details, but she was an artist, and she helped us all see things. She didn't point them out. I mean, she didn't, how shall I put it? She just helped us see things. Her seeing them helped us seeing them. That was it. That was it. When my sister and I first visited from the East Coast, after they had bought this, and after Daddy had died and she had settled in here, Betty Ruth and I came out. Our husbands were busy working, and we came out and visited her. And she asked what we thought of the view. And, oh, it's lovely. It's very nice. Of course, it doesn't have a view of Long's Peak like the Scottage does. And she said, true, but the composition is better. She said, at the Scottage, there's that straight line of the South Lateral moraine going straight across under Long's Peak. Whereas here, if you see it from down at the front where you can see Long's Peak, it's the whole thing she thought was better composition. McGregor and Black Canyon and the Needles and so forth. So
That's great. This might be obvious, but being the daughter of a local artist, why do you think Estes Park has attracted so many talented artists?
I saw that question. I was trying to think of an answer. Well, it's just such a beautiful place. That's obvious.
And do you think that's why your mother chose to build her studio here? And
No. Well, yes, but it was because she had inherited enough to have a house and land here. And it was a place that she had loved for a very long time. Before she ever met my father, when she was still in college, I think, and hadn't met him, she came out for she worked summers when she was at Colorado College. She worked at least one summer as a, not housemaid, housekeeper, something, for the Elkhorn Lodge. She worked out there at the Elkhorn Lodge. So she knew a little bit about the place, even if she didn't know about the Scottish at that time. She had also been to some kind of, what do they still have? Has special lectures, and there's one of them left just up from Boulder. There are others around the country. It's a proper name that's been there for a couple of centuries, I guess. No, I can't remember. But she and her mother had attended one of those. And she was more of a Colorado person, even if she was born in North Dakota. She lived most of her life right here in Colorado.
Are there any other individuals that, kind of are the big names in our history, whether it's back-a-ways or even more recent, that you'd like to recall or share any stories about?
I wish. My memory just isn't that good. There have been so many wonderful people that I've known of, not necessarily known personally, but who was the doctor who started the Scottish Festival?
Dr. Durward.
Dr. Durward. And wasn't his house on North Lane right down just beyond where East Lane comes in? There's a house there that, if I right, was his. I don't think I ever met him myself, but I heard of him, and I guess Mama knew him. Of course there was McDonald. Why can't I remember her first name? What's her?
Paula?
Paula, yes, Paula. I sort of got to know her early on because we were always book people. There's a very wonderful person here now. I'll think of her name in a moment. She, I don't think has yet been named a pioneer by the museum, but she should, because she's the weaver, very active. She's active with the Art Center.
Chris Switzer.
Switzer, yes, Chris Switzer, Switzerland. Yeah, she let George and me come out there and meet the llamas. And she has done so much to benefit this whole community in many ways.
Being in a historic structure and being in Estes Park for so long, are there any stories you'd like to tell about the 2020 fire evacuation?
Mm, no, I was very lucky to have my niece, Dodie Coyce, who came up with one of her daughters in two cars, no, both of them in one car, so that they could pick up me and some of our possessions that I had gathered, knowing that this would come, that the time would come, and a few bags, go bags, and take me down and put me up in her house for, what was it, 5 days or so. Peter helped with that. He had his Jeep, and I had a, what's the most, Subaru, yes, which in Japanese is pronounced Subaru. Anyway, my Subaru, between all of them, they got me and some of our most precious things down. Peter elected to stay here and sort of take care of the house. He had gotten roof sprinklers. He had done the research to find out what was recommended, had acquired them, had installed them. We have 5 sprinklers up on our house right now. And he elected to stay. He checked in with the all the fire workers and assured them that he would be out of the way, stay off the road, out of their way. But he and we only had one dog at the time. If I remember correctly, Katie was still with us at that time. And so I was just so grateful that we were not as involved as other people were, not in danger the way they were.
You've mentioned the United Methodist Church, United Methodist Women's. Are there other Estes Park affiliations that you've worked with or that you support?
Well, the museum, which I haven't done enough for, but I love, and my mother was very passionate about the museum. And actually, when she was about to celebrate, I think it must have been her 77th birthday, she had a sort of a little family reunion. It wasn't a very big thing, but she asked people as a present to her to contribute to a little fund for the museum, and she was able to make us sort of, or have us, I don't remember the details, a little presentation out behind the museum.
You're a supporter of the Art Center as well?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, Mama joined that. She wasn't one of the founders of it, but she joined it immediately and continued her membership. So when George and I moved out here, we joined, and because of having so many things to do to keep up the family connections, plus spending all my Saturdays from May, first Saturday in May to the last Saturday in October was what I volunteered in the park. And I just didn't have time enough to do all the things I would like to have done for the other organizations.
You've done a lot. I'll say that much.
Nothing compared to some of the people that I know.
So we always kind of wrap it up with just keeping it open-ended. Are there other stories or antics that you'd like to share with us that we maybe didn't get to cover today?
Oh, lots and lots, lots and lots.
Would you like to share some with us?
I would love to anytime, but I don't think, I don't think this has anything directly to do with Estes Park, but look back there at the back wall. Do you see the spaceship going up above the flame. I was a true active candidate for teacher in space.
Wow.
And that certificate proves it. And who is there? It's been in the news. He either died recently or was in the news recently. Who was in the space agency who flew to the moon? Who is it? Was in the news recently?
I'm not sure. What year did that take place? What did that look like for you? How did you get into that role?
Sneak back and look at it. Let me think. I remember thinking that if I had been selected, I would have been 60. Well, add 27 and 60. What do you get?
87.
And so it would have been the year before that. It was probably 86 that was going on. And I didn't get to be the candidate from Ohio, but I was far enough along so that George and I were invited at our expense to go down to Florida, and we met the one who died the next year. Those of us who were teachers, because this was to be the teacher in space. Oh, come on, everybody knows her name. She got on the bus that we were touring the space station with to say hello to us all. She and her runner-up, who I believe is still living, and there was someone, gosh, he either died recently or he was in the news for some reason, in the Trail Gazette. Anyway, I have been a fan of space and everything we're doing in space forever. My mother used to point out to me that she was born in 1903, which was the year that who invented the airplane, our Wright brothers, that the Wright brothers made their first flight down in North Carolina. And I was born in 1927, which was when Lindbergh made the first solo crossing of the Atlantic. And I like to tell my son, Peter, that he was born in 1961, which was the year that the first orbit around the Earth or something. And I've got to nail down, because it was, I remember lying on the table in labor and hearing that he had successfully made his flight.
That is great. Great. Okay, well, thank you for your time today. Thanks for sharing some of your memories.
It has been so much fun. I really love yakking.